Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner, co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum at the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin, 4700 Grover Avenue. We would welcome you to any of our forums, which are free and open to the public. They're almost every Sunday at noon. For more information about our forums, please go to our website at www.austinuu.org. And now to introduce our speaker today, Luke Metzger, we have Dale Beulah. Dale?
Thank you, Bonnie. This morning we are very pleased to have Luke Metzger. He is the founder and director of Environment Texas. In fact, he is Environment Texas. I've worked with him on several issues with the legislature. You may or may not know that our legislature needs help in these areas. He plays a key role in many of our successful campaigns in Texas. He was very successful in approving bonds for the Barton Springs watershed. He really has been a lobby for the protection of Texas resources, and water is among those. We'd like to welcome him with a big round of applause as he presents the Water Wars in Texas. Will you welcome him, please?
Good morning, or good afternoon now. And thank you, Dale. We actually made a movie with Dale and Pat as the stars a few years ago about energy conservation, kind of profiling their home and the way they live, and as models to the state. So if you haven't seen it, you should check it out. It's on our Vimeo page, and I can link to it on our Environment Texas page, environmenttexas.org. And thanks for the kind words. Often in the kind of political organizing and lobbying word, I'll hear negative words instead. So one that was amusing to me just last week, we have endorsed President Obama, and we're doing some work to organizing to help his reelection, which has incited some anger. So I got a phone call last week, a voicemail that left where they called me a few things that I'm not sure whether I can say in church or on TV, but I'll go ahead and say it anyway. So I was called an abysmal ballsack, a Illuminati puppet, and then this one I actually liked, a gay-loving goofball. It's as the Reverend said this morning in his sermon. Sometimes you have to try and love the people that are mean to you or say are not very nice to you. So thank you so much for inviting me to be here this morning to talk about water issues. Tell you a little bit about Environment Texas. We are a nonprofit grassroots organization. One of our young staff may have come to your door asking to sign a petition or get involved in our campaigns. And we work on a range of issues where we feel that there are threats to Texas's environment, whether it's the pollution in our waters or contamination in our air that's making people sick, or threats to our public lands. And so we work to tackle some of the biggest challenges and work to actually have an impact. So we start with research. We work to identify smart strategies of how we can win at the legislature or in Congress or at regulatory agencies. And then the bulk of our work is really working to mobilize public support because we know on issue after issue the public wants a clean environment. They want our public lands and parks protected. And usually the only reason that they're not being protected is because there's a powerful interest standing in the way. And so what we work to do is to help have Texans' voices heard by signing petitions and going and meeting with their legislators and getting the word out and educating the public in the media. And so that's the bulk of the work that I do and our staff at Environment Texas do. So when I actually am not a native of Texas, I moved here 12 years ago. I was an Army brat, and so I grew up all over the world, Germany, Alabama, California. But I moved here as soon as I could and just immediately fell in love with Texas, and especially Central Texas and the Hill Country and all the amazing rivers and streams and springs that we have here in this state. And I think it's, as a newcomer and I think for everyone that's been born and raised here, we're all just very aware of how special our water supply is here, how precious it is, and how vulnerable it is. And that, of course, was put into highlighted very severely in the last couple of years with the drought. So as folks are well aware, 2011 was the worst drought in Texas history and put real strain on our water supplies. And so what I want to talk about today is, what the drought looked like and, what the impacts were, especially to the environment. Talk about the water challenges that we face in the coming decades. Who are some of the biggest water wasters, and what are the opportunities that we have to conserve water to make sure that we have enough water to keep in our rivers and streams so that we can continue floating our rivers or swimming or fishing, as well as making sure there's enough water in our rivers and estuaries to protect wildlife. So, I think by now we're all very familiar with the images of the drought that we've seen over the last year and a half, 2 years. So a photo, of course, of Lake Travis. Lake Travis was hit hard, as were many lakes around the state. At one point, every reservoir and every lake in the state was less than 60% full. There were actually 7 reservoirs that were effectively empty. And that had a real impact, certainly, on our water supply and whether we have enough water to meet our needs, as well as recreation. So, for example, we know that with lower lakes, a lot fewer people went to visit our lakes or went to our state parks. Our state parks, which are chronically underfunded, lost about $5 million in fewer visits and revenue from those visits. Lake Travis, a study was done, found that when lake levels are low, visitors spend about $23 to $33 million less. And so those businesses that rely on the lakes are especially hard hit. So this is O.C. Fisher Lake out in San Angelo. Normally it's about 5,400 acres. It's basically down to just a couple of puddles. This is the same lake, because of the droughts, it created a toxic algae that turned the puddles red. This is the Rio Grande River, which, in places, can be pretty mighty and great for whitewater rafting, but, in times of severe drought, it's down to a trickle or even completely bone dry, as it is here in Big Bend. Wildlife, of course, suffered. Monarch butterflies, the food supply diminished, taking a real toll on their population. Horses, many horse owners basically couldn't afford to feed their horses anymore, and so had to set them loose and let them fend for themselves, potentially starving to death. Same is true for some cattle, where farmers couldn't keep the cattle fed. And then, of course, the Houston toad really impacted by the Bastrop fires, which were certainly fueled by the drought. Whooping cranes. There have been some press reports this summer that the whooping cranes did okay, although the Aransas Project is a nonprofit group that studies the whooping crane population on the Texas coast. It found that the drought actually led to about 12% of the flock being diminished, the population. And we're only talking about, there's 300 of these birds, and so a 12% hit is a big cut. And basically what, they rely on freshwater inflows coming from our rivers into our estuaries that then provide the necessary ingredients for their food supply, blue crabs and other things that they eat. And so as there's less water in our rivers, there's less food for the whooping cranes. We also know that 300 million trees died in Texas, all across the state, fueled in part by the drought, and as many as 5 million trees in urban areas. So then, of course, local communities were also very much impacted. I think we all know Spicewood Beach, literally ran out of water. They turned the faucet on, nothing came out, so had to have it delivered from miles away. Towns like Brownwood considered treating their wastewater to use as drinking water, which is something that's done normally, or is often or sometimes done. But usually, you treat it, then put it back into an aquifer, and then you get it back out later. So this would be direct treatment, which is, for a lot of people, has a big yuck factor. So we've heard a lot about that. The drought was so last year. Of course, we know that we're still in the middle of it. It's not as bad as it was last year, so you can see this map from the drought monitor. Last year around this time, the whole state would have been red or was red, which is some of the worst, exceptional drought, red and purple. Today, though, still we're seeing 57% of the state is in some stage of drought, and 84% of the state is abnormally dry. And so that's still having a big toll, especially on areas in West Texas and in South Texas. Here in Central Texas, we're not immune. This is Lake Travis. It's still, it's more than half empty, Lake Travis, and we continue to be in a very vulnerable situation. So we know that, droughts come and go, that's a way of life in Texas, but we know also, science shows that global warming is having a big impact, making droughts more severe, especially just, the hotter it is, the more evaporation there is, the less water we have, the more the soil is dry, and it causes serious problems. And we know that in terms of rainfall, predictions statewide are that global warming might necessarily not have an impact on rainfall, although certain areas it will. We'll see less precipitation in certain parts of the state. We also know that with global warming, that when it does rain, it's more likely to come in infrequent downpours. So the old expression, when it rains, it pours, is becoming more and more true with global warming. So rather than having a steady rainfall that that our rivers and our land can absorb and use, we're instead seeing heavy downpours, which cause flooding and more damage, and also just makes it we have less ability to store that water. Of course, we know that droughts come and go. Climate change is making it worse. We also know that the state is growing. We're expected to increase our population by 84% in the next few decades, and so water demands are going to increase. The Texas Water Development Board has estimated that if in the year 2060 we have another drought of record, like either last year or from the 50s, we're going to need another 8 million acre feet of water, and an acre foot is basically an acre covered with 1 foot of water deep. So to put that in terms you might more easily understand, I crunched the numbers, and that turns out to be enough water to fill the Dallas Cowboys Stadium 3,500 times. So some people question whether the methodology of the Water Development Board, whether they're overestimating how much the water demand is, but I think we all agree, though, that we're going to continue to face increasing pressure on our water supplies, and with growth, we're going to need to do something different. That if we continue as business as usual, we're going to face some very dire consequences. Let's talk a little bit about where the water is being used here in Texas. So you can see that 56% of all the water in Texas in 2010 was used for irrigation, for agriculture. Next up was municipal, 27%, so our cities. Then manufacturing at 9%, power plants 4%, and then livestock and drilling, so oil and gas drilling, and also mining used about 2% as well. So within that, we know we're finding more and more that there's lots of waste happening. So when we use that water, we're not using it as efficiently as we can. In the peak of the drought last year, we had over 1,000 water utilities institute drought restrictions, which meant more than 15 million Texans individually had to scale back their water use and water their lawns less frequently, perhaps not automatically get a glass of water at the restaurant, other things, not have car washes, other things. So many, and certainly there were abuse within that, but largely, most Texans in the state took part and did their part to help save water amidst this big crisis. And unfortunately, we still see that, especially among some of the biggest industries in the state, that those same kinds of restrictions or the same kinds of effort to save water aren't necessarily happening. So I just want to talk about just some of the different areas where where there's inefficiencies in our water system. So in agriculture, we still use largely sprinklers to water our crops, And this has high rates of evaporation, especially the higher the sprinklers are off from the plants and from the ground. You're seeing a lot of that water, usually about 10% of the water is lost to evaporation. We also have lots of unlined irrigation ditches, and we know that, for example, that there's unlined ditches lead to high rates of seepage as well as evaporation. So, for example, in the lower Rio Grande Valley, there's an estimated 700 miles of unlined ditches, which is estimated to lose about 30 billion gallons of water every year. Now, that water can often seep into the ground and recharge our aquifers, so it's not necessarily the same kind of waste, but we know that means that water is not available for another use, including keeping it in our rivers for wildlife. There's also a threat then that fertilizers and pesticides from farm fields also seep and go into the aquifer, threatening the water quality as well. So within agriculture, there are a number of perverse incentives that inhibit efficient water use. So of course we know there's artificially low prices. People are probably well familiar with the low prices that rice farmers pay from Lower Colorado River Authority. As much as I think they pay $6 an acre foot, right? You might know, versus $150 that other folks pay. This is fed in part by federal subsidies that basically artificially depress the price of water, which then means if the water is so cheap, you don't have an incentive to try and save it. We also know that there's some problems with some crop insurance policies. So, for example, last year there were many reports of insurance companies that offer crop insurance policies. In order to have that policy redeemed, the farmers would have to prove that they tried to grow a crop, even if it was clear there's no chance of that crop surviving and actually making it. So the farmer, in some cases, would go ahead and plant the crop anyway, knowing very well it was going to fail, and then having to provide documentation like electric bills and other things to the insurance company to show that they actually tried. And then, of course, there's also just the use it or lose it policy with our water rights situation, where farmers are in a situation where if they don't take advantage of the water, they could lose the right to it, certainly in future years as well. Lawn watering. So, of course, we have, in Texas, about 10% of all the water that we use goes to water our lawns and landscaping. And so we know that there are lots of waste happening, certainly with use of very water-hungry plants, like, say, St. Augustine grass, or we also know that there's just inefficiencies in the irrigation systems. New homes actually use more water than old homes because developers are increasingly installing irrigation systems as a default, so they're automatically starting to use more and more water. And then, of course, there's just poor practices in terms of a lot of the water just running off onto the street. We also have an aging water system, such that there are huge amounts of water lost in our cities from broken pipes and water mains. In Austin, I think we estimate, the utility estimates that we lose about 10 to 12% of our water from broken pipes, and that's considered good. That's actually, kind of an industry standard, unfortunately. We can certainly do a lot more, and we should be doing a lot more in Austin. But other cities around the state, it gets as high as 30, 40, 50% of water is lost due to leaks in pipes. Power plants also use, as I said, about 4% of the water in the state. That's expected to rise to about 7.5% of all the water by 2060. So they use the water basically to cool, the power plants and the steam generation. Last year, the ERCOT, which is the operator of our electric grid for most of Texas, found that about many of the lakes that cool our power plants are at 10-year lows. And at one point, they estimated that about 3,000 megawatts of power, which is roughly about 3 or 4 big, nuclear or coal-fired power plants, might have to be taken offline because the water wasn't there to cool them. So that's what their projection was for this year if the drought had continued as bad as it was. They did have, though, some instances where power plants had to curtail. And, ERCOT has warned that, if we don't figure out ways to cool these power plants or figure out better ways to generate electricity, blackouts could become a real problem. Fracking. So everyone know what fracking is? Who knows what fracking is? Okay. Yeah, basically it's a technique used in especially gas drilling where companies will pump millions of gallons of water combined with sand and chemicals deep under the ground in order to break up the shale and get the gas up. And on average, it varies from part of the state, but it goes between 4 to 6 million gallons on average that are necessary to frack a single well. And that statewide, we estimate that gas companies used about 25 billion gallons of water last year. And it's somewhat unique from the other forms of water use that we see in that it's contaminated and then largely it's injected deep underground where it's removed forever from the water cycle. We don't get that back, unlike other water that recharges aquifers or evaporates and eventually comes back down as rain. That water's gone forever. And then, of course, there's other problems with injection wells as well. People have probably heard about earthquakes associated with them and threats of groundwater contamination. So, solutions. So the good news is that we have a lot of technology and practices at our fingertips that could save a significant amount of water. The Texas Water Development Board estimates that at least a third of our future water needs are going to come from conservation and reuse. A lot of us think that's lowballing it. We could do far, far better than that. But still, it's clear even the state recognizes that conservation has to be a big part of the solution. So in agriculture, we can use micro-irrigation, so where we apply water directly to the root of the crops. We only lose, I think, about 1% of the water through micro-irrigation compared to the sprinklers, which I said loses about 10% of the water. Laser leveling, so this is something that rice farms are increasingly using, and we're helping fund, which is when their fields are unlevel, the water can more easily run off and is lost, and then also can contaminate rivers and streams. By leveling the fields, you're able to keep more of the water where you need it. You can line the irrigation canals. If it's a small enough amount of water, you can use a pipeline, which is the best thing because then you have no seepage or evaporation. But the next best thing would be to line those canals with concrete and other kind of liners. Water metering. So right now, incredibly, of course, all of us have water meters in our homes, and we can see very precisely from month to month how much water we use. In agriculture, that's largely not the case. We estimate just about 2% of the acreage in Texas is actually metered. So instead, farmers will often look to their electric bill to try and estimate roughly how much water they use. But we know that the Water Development Board has found that simply installing a meter and actually letting farmers track their water use can cut the water use by 15%. Not even doing anything else, not installing any efficient technology, just by looking at your bill, the farmers can cut their water use by 15%. And that's something now that is starting to take place around the state. The High Plains Water District out in the Panhandle recently required the installation of meters. The Edwards Aquifer Authority and some other ones around the state also require meters. And we think that's a best practice we'd like to see roll out. So in our own homes, one of the things we can do instead of installing water-hungry St. Augustine or other kinds of grasses is use drought-resistant plants or xeriscaping, which I think is both very beautiful and doesn't uses a fraction of the water that a lot of our lawns use. And so we can do things like Austin Water Utility also has a program where you can get a rebate to rip out some of your old lawn and install drought-resistant plants. We'd like to see more of those kinds of programs both in Austin and statewide. The water utility also, as part of their plan to get the city to use just 140 gallons per capita per day, which is kind of a best practice that the state develops as a goal for most cities. In order to get that, they had proposed at one point to limit the amount of irrigated landscaping you're allowed to have to about 2.5 times the size of your house, which to me seems reasonable, and certainly given our water crisis, seems like something that we need to be doing. Unfortunately, the mayor called that draconian, and so it's probably not going anywhere anytime soon. But we need to look at different models, different user imagination, as the Reverend said this morning, to figure out other ways to address this problem. As I said, the power plants use 4% of our water. It's going to go to 7.5% water of our water use in the future. One simple thing we can do to avoid that water use is to switch to clean energy. Wind turbines don't use water. Solar panels largely don't use water. And also energy efficiency, for example, is a great way to help save water. The state of Texas in 2001 instituted building efficiency standards for new homes, requiring developers to make sure that homes meet basic efficiency standards for electricity. And we estimate that we've saved billions of gallons of water avoided from those power plants that would have produced electricity for those homes. So clean energy has to be a big part of the solution. Thankfully, it also has a lot of other benefits, like reducing climate change, which is worsening our droughts. And so I think this should be a big part of our solution. As I mentioned, in fracking, uses lots of water. We need to limit how much water can be used for fracking. So one thing that companies can do is recycle the water that's used in fracking. Right now, most of the water that's pumped underground to frack a well is left behind. Only about 20% kind of flows back up to the top of the well. So it's only a fraction of the water that's available to be recycled, but at a minimum, we should be doing that. It's crazy that we're not. We're still, it's still going to use a huge amount of water, but they should be required to recycle. Right now, we estimate only about 5% of the water used for fracking is recycled, of that 5%, of that 20%. We also need to be, like I said, just limit the amount of fresh water that's used. Make those companies look for alternatives like brackish water or other sources if they're going to frack. And certainly from our perspective, we have a lot of problems with fracking, but there's about 15,000 wells in Texas right now that are being fracked. We have to find policies to reduce their water use. So one of the things we've been doing is going on the road, educating the public about some of these water issues and where some of the water waste is happening and what we can do. One of the things we did was we had an inflatable pig, this thing called the Stop Water Hogs, which took around to help attract media attention and get some of these things on TV especially. Our staff have been going door to door, talking to the public, handing out literature of what you can do in your own home to save water, getting also people to sign petitions to the legislature, asking the legislature this coming session to act to save water, and then also doing research. We have a big report coming out later this month that quantifies how much water we can save through some of the policies that I've been talking about. And I think the legislature is under a lot of pressure to act. They have, for many years, talked about the state water plan, which is something that has been developed by the Water Development Board of how we're going to meet our water needs into the future. They estimate that that's going to cost $53 billion to fund, and that $53 billion is only a quarter of the total need, because then there's also the wastewater treatment plants and other infrastructure that could be needed. Of course, that's a big price tag, especially for a conservative legislature, and that's reticent to approve any new taxes or new fees. There's a few different policies that have been floated around to fund the water plan, and I should preface this by saying that we don't necessarily think the water plan is a good idea, because it's going to involve a lot of bad things that we don't like reservoirs and desal and other things. But what's being talked about is this water plan. Alan Ritter is a Republican from Netherlands. He's the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee. He proposed last session and in previous sessions a fee on your water bill or on your tap that would roughly be about $3 per Texan per year. That would be enough money to fund this water plan. A lot of the cities are resisting that approach. That approach also has some problems too, because that doesn't necessarily get at the biggest water user in the state, which is agriculture, which don't pay those same kind of tap fees. So that whole sector wouldn't be doing their part to contribute to our water needs. Another idea has been putting a tax on PVC pipe. Texas actually is the largest producer of PVC pipe in the country. PVC pipe used, of course, to transmit water as well as other things, and we sell that pipe all around the country. And so the idea would you put a fee on that, and not only do Texans help fund our water plan, but so does the whole world, because they're paying that fee on it. So that seems like an innovative approach as well. But and then finally, the third thing I've heard talked about is using the rainy day fund. So of course, that's perennially a target of legislators looking to fund a variety of programs, whether it's education or healthcare or whatever you have it. But there's talk of using a portion of that money to do a down payment on funding for this state water plan. It's unclear whether any of this is going to pass. Like I said, the legislature is severely conservative, to use the Mitt Romney term, and unclear whether anything is going to happen in terms of funding a plan. So one of the things that we've been doing then is looking at other policies. So we definitely think there definitely needs to be funding, especially for water conservation, funding to help farmers install more efficient irrigation systems, funding to help homeowners rip out their lawns and put in native grasses, things like that. So funding has to be part of the solution, but we also think there need to be standards set in place. Just like each of us is asked, especially during droughts, to restrict how much water we use on our lawns. We think everybody, including every industry, needs to do their share and help reduce their water use. And our hope is that, at least in a few of these policies, that we can actually get enough traction to pass a bill through the legislature this session. So, for example, I mentioned the recycling of fracking water. That's an issue that seems to be gaining a lot of traction. It's not very expensive to do it, so the industry certainly can do it. And there's getting kind of bipartisan support for doing something on, for example, on that. So the Water Development Board has estimated that if we do nothing, and we do face a drought of record in the year 2060, that we could lose $116 billion in lost income, about $9.8 billion in foregone state and local taxes, and about 1 million jobs that could be lost. So, for example, a lot of lawmakers are starting to hear of companies that are not willing to locate here or want to move because of concern that there won't be a water supply to meet their product, or make sure that there's water for their employees. Speaker Joe Strauss, who's the Speaker of the Texas House of Representatives, told a story at a forum last year of USAA, which is a big insurance company in San Antonio, threatening to leave San Antonio for Phoenix, of all places, because of concern that there wasn't a good plan to conserve water in San Antonio. And then San Antonio responded by adopting some of the best programs in the state to save water. And in fact, a lot of us think that, despite our green reputation here in Austin, we need to be looking much more to San Antonio for good solutions of how we can save water here. So these kind of numbers also, I think are scare legislators. Then talk. There's also, I think I've heard a story of companies, advertising, in Michigan, for example. Oh, we've got water. Come here. You don't have to. You've been maybe attracted to the Sun Belt, but there's some problems down there. We've got the water. Come move your business back to Michigan. So another thing that works in our favor is that not only is water conservation, the most environmentally responsible thing that we can do, it's also the cheapest thing we can do. And for some of these conservative lawmakers, these kinds of dollar and cents arguments, I think will add up. So we know that conservation can cost about $250 to $450 per acre foot. Groundwater desalination, so basically taking brackish water from some of the from groundwater sources and treating that, costs about $1,200 an acre foot. Importing, or kind of what they call interbasin transfers, so taking water from elsewhere in Texas, so for example maybe East Texas where there's more rain and the lakes are fuller, and piping it over to other parts of the state, $1,900. New reservoirs, LCRA estimated it would cost $2,150 an acre foot. Building, taking ocean water and desalinating it, which is a little harder and more expensive to do than groundwater desal, $28.90. And then the big ticket, dredging the Highland Lakes, so there's just more capacity in it, $263,000 per acre foot. So you'd think, well, it's a no-brainer. Of course, we're going to do water conservation. So why aren't we? Again, it goes back to those problems where there are powerful interests that are reservoir builders or pipeline companies or desal companies that are entrenched, have a lot of access, a lot of power with state officials, and they continue to get their way. And it's also there's a factor of we've done that for decades or centuries. We know how to do that. There's perhaps some trepidation that programs to encourage people to save water in their homes might not get us as much water, which of course have been shown false. We know that these are proven, these work, and they're cheap. But we have to overcome some of that opposition, both from kind of financial powerful interests as well as just the mindset that conservation and I think it was Dick Cheney that said conservation is a nice virtue, but it's not a way to plan policy around, which is of course very wrong-headed. So in conclusion, this is a photo of my son Gus and my girlfriend Rachel. We were here in the service this morning. This is us on the Neches River out in East Texas. And we got to paddle that a couple weeks ago. And for me, it's also just a good reminder of what's at stake. If we don't do water conservation, this river might not be there in the future because, for example, the city of Dallas was working to dam the Neches River, which would have flooded about 25,000 acres of pristine bottomland forests, harming wildlife, forcing people off their properties through use of eminent domain. Like we're seeing with the Keystone Pipeline now, or certainly, I think more dramatically, some of the images in China of people just being forcibly removed from their property to build these giant water projects. So that's what's at stake. If we aren't maximizing our water conservation, we might have serious water issues where we don't have the water, but we also might, the interests that want to destroy this river might win. Thankfully, in this example, the local community rose up, fought back, and was able to get the Fish and Wildlife Service to declare it a national wildlife refuge because it is one of the last wild rivers, unprotected wild rivers in Texas. Governor Perry and the Water Development Board sued the Fish and Wildlife Service, went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court denied the state of Texas's petition. So the Fish and Wildlife Service prevailed, and the wildlife refuge is now in place. And now the effort is to acquire some of the land in order to complete the refuge. But yeah, so that's, for me, it's this special place I got to enjoy with my son and my loved one. And I want, to see that it's there. And then also, of course, it's, making sure that he's got, and we're dealing him a tough plate to a lot of burdens in the future, but he and his classmates are going to have to deal with in the future, and it's up to us to make sure that we're doing our part, saving the water, so that future generations have it to work with. So, thank you so much for having me here today.
Well, I know there's some questions. Richard Halpin.
Thank you, Bonnie Gardner, and the wonderful Forum Committee for bringing this fabulous speaker to us today. You talked about solutions, and you talked about them so well, and they made such perfect sense. I wonder, and then you started a little later to talk about how those solutions what they could save and what they could cost. So when you go to the legislature with policy ideas, I know this sounds naive, but can you say to them, look, if you pay for this set of solutions, it will make you enough money to not only retrieve the money you spend on the solutions, but actually make you more money. So
right.
The city of Austin loses so much money through broken pipes. If you pay up front for the broken pipes, you'll get more water and you'll save more money. So
right.
Can you use that as a policy? And when it doesn't work with a legislature who doesn't want to hear about it, could we then, like the Neches, take it to the Supreme Court and win? Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and absolutely, I think that's a big part of our arguments is showing that, this saves money, and thankfully we've got good examples like in San Antonio where they've been able to save, the water utility there has been able to estimate how much more money, how much they would have had to raise rates on their consumers to pay for big pipeline projects or dams and other things, and how they've been able to avoid that and have some lower rates because of investing in conservation, or businesses that have taken advantage of water conservation, and that's helped them cut their costs in a competitive marketplace. So we definitely have great examples like that, and then yeah, as you said though, often sometimes reason doesn't prevail, and you have to be imaginative and use other means. The legal, or kind of going through the courts, unfortunately hasn't been that fruitful for us, other than this example with the Neches River. There's been the Texas Supreme Court had some really bad rulings. Like there was a court case called the Day case that basically might limit some of the groundwater districts from limiting pumping of our aquifers. So in some ways, the law is going even backwards and even worse. And so I think what's critical about this drought is it was so severe, the public's so high on the minds of people. We've got a moment in time where we have to capitalize on that. We have to show the legislature not only does this make sense, not only is it cost effective, but your constituents demand it. You cannot leave Austin until you've done something. That's going to take, I think, organizing. It's going to take education. It's going to take mobilizing people to demand it.
Yeah, you touched on it, but do you have any comments about the rule of capture and the risks of privatizing the water supplies?
Yeah. So yeah, Texas's water policy is really backwards. And it's very complex. I'm new to the issue, and so I'm still learning about it. So I can't speak authoritatively about it. But basically, dating back a couple centuries, our water law basically says that first in time, first in right. Whoever got there first gets to maximize it, even though it's a common resource, an aquifer that we all share. That also then puts water into our rivers and streams. That if you can pump as much as you want out of the aquifer from your well, there's some limitations on that. Like the Edwards Aquifer Authority has some limits on pumping, but like I said, with that court case, those limits might be in jeopardy. So yeah, part of it, certainly, some of the issues I've talked about on water conservation, they are, I think, important. But in order to solve our water problems, we definitely need to address, just the issue of water rights and changing the definitions to recognize that this is a resource that we all own, that we need to manage together as a community, or we have the tragedy of the commons. And then in terms of water privatization, yeah, I think that's a real danger that especially this resource that is so fundamental to life, that if we kind of privatize it. Such that companies could, charge rates as much as they want, that is very dangerous in terms of making sure that we've got enough water for human needs as well, certainly for the environment. So I think that's something we need to be mindful of and watch out for.
We have a question here, Becky Halpin.
Thank you. Thank you, Bonnie. I know you mentioned that water is very inexpensive for agricultural users, and of course we all like to eat. But rice farming seems like a very water-intense crop to be growing now in Texas.
Right.
Has there been any discussion of how we could get farmers to adopt other kinds of crops? I mean, it's cheap, but this year they didn't get any water at all. So I'm sure they're thinking about it too, I would hope.
Right. Yeah, no, I think there are, certainly with the drought, I know some farmers are switching to other crops. Now, of course, I think there was the Consumer Reports story that came out a few months ago. I found that some of the Texas rice actually might, have some toxins in them as well. So that might also be shifting. But yeah, I think, at some point we have to ask ourselves, is this the right place to be growing rice? Especially given our water needs. Whether I can't imagine the legislature ever telling them that they're not allowed to do that. And there's some there's pros and cons to it as well. So for example, when the rice farms flood their fields, that actually can be a very good habitat for migratory birds and other things. So it's not so black and white in terms of the crops. But so we think, yeah, at a minimum, they need to be doing as much as they can to conserve water because they've just barely scraped the surface of the potential there.
We have a question here. Would you state your name?
Thank you, Bonnie. My name is Daniela, and I thank you for your information, and I understand your frustration. There are so many things where even if you provide education, there is, you don't have teeth, But as an organization, trying to create more awareness, you have forums like this. But what is really your ability to influence education deeper into a younger generation? Do you have any partnerships with other nonprofits, and do you actually have some sort of a strategy to influence the education plans, in schools and middle school, college, so that more people get the picture earlier on?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are some really great programs out there, and Dale actually just emailed me a story from the Texas Tribune from Friday looking at the Lubbock schools, and they've had programs there since the 50s of educating kids about water. And we know anecdotally that it works. The kids go home and then they talk to their parents and like, how could we be wasting all this water? Mom and Dad, let's do this and this and this. And actually, by getting to the kids, you can get to the whole family. So the parents are like, oh, you're right. I guess I do need to be doing that. And so that there's not a lot of good estimates of how much water it saves, but we know anecdotally that it works. Here in Austin, they have a program called Dowser Dan, where they go to schools and teach kids about water conservation. So what we're doing is, our goal primarily is to get the funding so there's more of those kinds of programs, because they definitely work. We need more of them. And so we're working to pushing the water utility, pushing the state to put more money towards those kinds of programs.
We have a question here. Annalise, would you stand up, please?
Yes. Thank you for coming today. I just would like to get your impression about what I learned through the Texas Parks and Wildlife documentaries. The Texas is inheriting more of the desert-like conditions from the West, and it doesn't seem to be public knowledge because a lot of people are still watering their St. Augustine grass. So can you address that a little bit?
Yeah, certainly from kind of the I-35 west, it is arid conditions. East Texas, not so much. They actually get quite a bit of rainfall out in the piney woods out there. But yeah, especially for us in Austin, San Antonio, Dallas, I think people don't recognize that the conditions we have here in Texas are not sustainable to have those kinds of lawns, and that if you want to live in Texas, that we need to be in Texas to prosper, we need to be looking at new ways to, value our homes and find beauty. Because of course, lawns can be nice. Certainly, as a kid, or as a father of a kid, it's nice to be able to let your kid run around on the lawn and play, and it's safe. But in Texas, it's just certainly in a lot of areas, it's just not sustainable. And so, I think certainly with last year, as people watch their lawns wither, under the watering restrictions and the drought. I think people are more and more aware of that. That doesn't make sense, especially from a financial perspective, to invest all this money in a lawn that might just die or might not look very nice from year to year. And so, but we need to continue to educate people on that, get them to look at alternatives, and actually realize that it's actually quite nice. Some of the native grasses here. Can really make your home beautiful.
We have a question from Douglas Bauer.
Thank you for coming today. I wanted to get back to the use of large amounts of water for irrigation and agricultural purposes. I think you said 56%. It was more than half anyway. A couple of the comments you made was that they were paying much below what we would be paying for industrial or city uses for the price of water. And then the third comment was that there was inefficient usage of sprinkling, like above ground sprinklers for irrigation. Since we have a severely conservative legislature, it seems like one possibility that would fix all these things would be to have agriculture uses paying somewhat similar prices to what the rest of the state does. Could you comment on that as a possibility and whether or not there's any hope of getting it through our government?
Yeah, no, absolutely right. I think that's we need, in order to for people to for the market to work, water has to be priced appropriately, and it's certainly not right now. In part because of there's federal subsidies from the Bureau of Reclamation that drive down the price of water, and then also some of the river authorities, which in part are controlled, like the LCRA, have strong interests from some of the ag communities that drive down the price. Of course, with the rice farmers, they pay a lower rate in exchange for the possibility that their water supply might be interrupted, as it was last year, that kind of structure isn't necessarily a bad thing. So that's something we look at in energy conservation, where we pay people, pay companies to be willing to turn off their lights or whatever in the midst of a kind of heavy, near blackout situation, and they get slightly less, lower rates as a result. So that kind of structure isn't necessarily a bad thing, but even within that, the rates are still way too low. They could be paying a lot more and still have that kind of incentive to be willing to curtail. In terms of whether that's possible to happen, I don't know. Certainly, I don't think at the Texas legislature, but maybe river authority to river authority. So, for example, I think the Neches River Authority charges like twice what the LCRA charges for some of their downstream agricultural users. There's starting to be a growing constituency, the Central Texas Water Coalition, which is made up of homeowners and businesses along Lake Travis. Have a lot of political power and are using that to press the LCRA to make some changes. So, for example, the chair of that coalition is a county judge from Burnett County, and she's next door neighbors with the chairman of the Senate Natural Resources Committee, and she uses that influence to set Troy Frazier to get action at the LCRA. So I think there's the politics are starting to change. Such that the business community that relies on water in the lakes are organizing to demand changes, and we need them to do that. Only chance to get some of these decision makers to act is if the business community is the messenger and is organizing to get them to do that.
We have a question from Dale Beulah.
Yes, question and comment. I wonder how many people here in this room know how many gallons of water they used last month. Could you raise your hand if you know how many gallons you used? So you see, that shows that we have a long way to go. If we don't even know how much we're using.
Right.
My wife and I used 900 gallons last month. And I think that until we raise our own consciousness, it's going to be hard for us to make progress. So I encourage all of you to go home and check your water bill and see what your usage was last month, just like we do for electricity. Right. And also the table in the back has some educational material, so please take those with you and share them with your neighbors, and join us afterwards for the continued conversation. My concern has been for the legislature and its short-sightedness. It seems to me that even though conservation is cheaper, maybe we haven't awakened yet. I think the people in New York and New Jersey suddenly decided maybe there is such a thing as global warming. You would think with the drought hitting us that awareness in that area would have risen in this state. Have you seen any change in legislatures since the last session?
Change in attitudes? Yeah, there's unfortunately not a whole lot of good polling, certainly for Texas, on that. We do know, though, I think actually UT has done polling nationwide and found that there's a direct link in people's belief in global warming and human-caused global warming and severe weather. So likely we've seen an increase in consciousness here in Texas and increasing link. Nationwide, I think we're at about 65% now believe that global warming is happening and is dangerous and we need to do something about it. I imagine Texas is probably a little less than that. But hopefully not too much more or less, especially after the wildfire. Last year was the hottest year on record. More than 130 people died from heat-related causes. The wildfires are the worst in Texas history. The Bastrop State Park, which is one of my favorite places in Texas, wiped out the trees there. And then, of course, the drought, which caused $8 billion in economic damages. Hopefully those kinds of things are waking people up that this isn't normal. This is something that's and again, we know the drought comes and it's something that Texas faces. We had one, I think, in '96, but as climate scientists tell us, it's basically loading the dice such that we're, increasing potentially the frequency and then certainly the severity of some of these droughts.
We have time for one very quick last question from Russell Eskew.
Thank you, Bonnie. Hi, I was out in Gillespie County yesterday, and there was a 30% chance of rain, and it downpoured for about an hour. Is this an extreme weather condition where we're going from drought to Texas flooding?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, of course, we can't say any individual event is linked to global warming, but we do know that global warming increases the frequency of severe storms, and so I think we estimated in Texas, and from 60 years ago, we have 24% more severe storms, and because we're seeing with higher rates of evaporation and more moisture going into the atmosphere, creating kind of denser clouds and conditions such that when it does rain, it just comes down on us and it floods. It causes lots of damage, loss of human life, damage to property, and so that's definitely a growing threat. And also then, even though we're so thankful that it is raining, we just our lakes and our streams can't handle it all at once like that, and so we don't even get the full value of it.
Well, I think we're almost out of time, but I'd like to ask you if you could give us one takeaway message. What would it be?
Sure, thank you. Well, I think, like Dale said, definitely look at your water bill and see how much you're using, and start thinking about ways you can save water in your own home and in your neighborhoods. But also, I think to solve this problem, individual action is not enough. We need collective action. We need people to join together to demand our water utility, demand the legislature, demand other interests, act to save water. So definitely write your legislators. Definitely, if you want to get involved, we have an email list. You can go to environmenttexas.org. We'll be emailing about ways that you can help out this legislative session, because we need a lot of help as well. So.
Well, thank you for a very timely and informative talk, and I think we've learned a lot more about this issue than certainly any of us knew before you spoke with us. Thanks again so much.
Thank you.